Fukuyama, Political Order and Political Decay, chapters 5 through 8, lecture 3. This lecture is going to be really short because I'm not going to hold you accountable for a great deal of the historical information provided in it. I'm just going to give you an overview. And this chapter is about Britain and the way that Britain broke out of patronage politics. So remember, in lecture 1, I talked about corruption, patronage, clientelism, rent-seeking, the various disadvantages of those things and some of the advantages. In lecture 2, I talked about Greece and Italy as examples of low trust societies that end up with sort of inefficient and sometimes incompetent states because democratization occurred in such a way that large clientelistic networks were built, making demands on the state before the state could actually become competent, and therefore it works against it because the state is used as a source to extract resources from, and thus is not oftentimes very competent or efficient. Now, Britain had a lot of patronage, and chapter 8 is about the way that the patronage system in Great Britain was reformed in the course of the 19th century. And as I said, I'm just going to talk about a few things here. I mean, basically, at the root of the movement was the perceived and felt weakness of the Indian civil service, the civil service governing India, which created a sort of a reform coalition made up of aristocrats in part, middle-class public servants in part, and politicians. And this is a group that over time was able to overcome the entrenched interests that existed with the existing patronage system and bring about reforms, right? Because when you bring about reform, it almost always involves displacing at least some of those people who benefit from the status quo. Right, so the status quo was a sort of corrupt and at times incompetent patronage system. You had middle-class, aristocratic, and politician reformers who over time were able to kind of win out in the competition with the status quo to bring about reforms. They did this in part by using the media to bring the broader British middle class over to their view of meritocracy. So part of this was a campaign of ideas of arguing for the need for meritocratic systems of civil service. And, that happened in the United States too, this power of ideas. Now, of course, this does coincide oftentimes with the interests of those middle class people pushing for the reform. So it's not simply disinterested. I mean, oftentimes these calls for civil service reform were themselves carried out by professionals who were the sort of people that thought, I'm the sort of person that the government should hire. Now, that doesn't mean that it was simply self-interested. It wasn't simply self-interested. It was based on principled arguments about the importance of qualified, talented people doing the public business, as opposed to just well-connected insiders enmeshed in patronage networks. So part of the push for reform in England came from, basically a publicity campaign to try to bring public opinion over to demand meritocratic reforms in the British government. Now, the funny thing is that this kind of reform that happened in the 1800s was made possible in part because Britain was not really a democracy. The elite, the British elite, those who were really kind of politically empowered, was small and narrow enough that these reform coalitions were able to form within the elite itself. They made appeals to broader public opinion, but there's still a fairly narrow elite that actually could get things done. So this elite was narrow enough to form reform coalitions within itself, and the British state was powerful enough to implement those reforms. So the British state was not in a situation such as pre-revolution France, where the monarch or the governing powers were simply incapable of pushing through reforms because there was too much resistance. In the case of Britain, the state was powerful enough that when this reform coalition was able to kind of take the reins, they could make the reforms that were needed, professionalizing the civil service. And so, in a way loosely similar to Prussia, a competent state was built before effective democratization occurred in Britain. Now, Britain was more democratic, more accountable than Prussia was, but it was still not a mass democracy at this time. And so, what this meant in the case of Britain is that they were able to reform the patronage networks, but without there being a kind of clientelistic capture of the state, right? You didn't yet have mass parties seeking favors for their clients. Government was in a relatively small number of hands. And that meant, this is one of the reasons why in Britain, as opposed to, say, in Italy, when mass parties begin to develop, they are more programmatic in character. And just what that means, just a programmatic party means a party that's sort of unifying feature is a common set of principles or a common set of programs. So you join the party because you are loyal to that party's program. It's not that you join that party because that's the party that gives jobs to the people in your village or something like that. So basically, again, you have a kind of state building prior to democracy in Britain as in Prussia. And so in terms of sequence, there's a pretty strong argument to be made in terms of state building that a good state, you have a better chance of having a competent state if that state is built under more kind of authoritarian or oligarchic forms of government. Although putting it that way is still, I think, a little bit overly broad. But that's the upshot. And that's really all I have to say about Chapter 8. So even though this is a very short lecture, I'm going to leave it there. And in the next series of lectures, we'll be looking at the United States and reform, patronage, clientelism, and reform efforts in the United States.